The forest held its breath. Corporal Jimmy Holloway pressed his back against the splintered trunk of what had once been a proud oak, now reduced to a skeletal monument of artillery fire. His fingers, numb from the December cold, traced the contours of his Browning automatic rifle, 20 pounds of American engineering that had become an extension of his own body over the past 8 months. The metal was so cold it burned through his gloves. But he didn't dare let go. Not now. Not when he could hear them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. German voices carried through the pre-dawn mist like ghosts reciting prayers. They were close. Too close. The words were indistinct, muffled by distance and the fog that clung to the Ardennes forest floor like something alive, something that fed on fear and transformed it into atmosphere. Jimmy could see his own breath, short, controlled puffs that he tried to keep shallow, quiet, invisible. 300 yards to his left, the bunker sat like a tumor on the hillside. Concrete and steel German efficiency made manifest. It had been silent for 20 minutes, which meant nothing. Silence in war was never peace. It was anticipation. It was the held breath before the scream. Jimmy had learned that in North Africa, had it reinforced in Sicily, and had it beaten into his soul at Normandy. Now, in the frozen hell of Belgium's winter, that lesson felt more true than ever. Jimmy! The whisper came from Private Danny Reeves, a kid from Ohio who still looked like he should be delivering newspapers instead of delivering death. Danny was crouched behind a fallen log 10 feet away. His Springfield rifle clutched across his chest like a talisman. His face was pale, had been pale since they'd crossed into Belgium 3 weeks ago. The kid had seen things. They all had. You think they know we're here? Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He was counting. A habit he'd developed somewhere between the landing at Omaha Beach and the liberation of Paris. Count the seconds between sounds. Count the intervals between movements. Numbers were clean. Numbers made sense. Numbers didn't scream when they died. 15 seconds of silence. Then a cough from inside the bunker. Human. Nervous. Someone lighting a cigarette, perhaps. The small comforts men clung to when they knew death was negotiating just outside their walls. They know, Jimmy finally whispered back. His voice was rough, sandpapered by cold and exhaustion. They always know. Question is whether they care enough to do something about it. Behind them, Sergeant Marcus Webb was doing what Marcus always did, keeping everyone alive through sheer force of will and tactical genius. Marcus was from Georgia, a black man who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor despite knowing the uniform wouldn't protect him from the hatred back home. But out here, in the mud and blood of Europe, Marcus had earned something more valuable than respect. He'd earned trust. Every man in their squad would follow him into hell itself, which was fortunate, because that's exactly where they'd been living for months. Marcus crawled forward, his movements economical and practiced. At 42, he was ancient by infantry standards, but that age came with wisdom. He positioned himself between Jimmy and Danny, his eyes scanning the bunker through the morning gloom. Contact, he breathed, barely audible. Left side, machine gun nest. 2, maybe 3 operators. Main entrance is reinforced, but there's ventilation on the eastern wall. RPG took out their radio antenna yesterday, so they're deaf to command. Isolated. Jimmy nodded, processing. The bar in his hands suddenly felt heavier, though he knew that was just psychology. The weapon weighed exactly what it had always weighed. It was the responsibility that accumulated mass. How many inside? This from Corporal Luis Chavez, their medic, who'd positioned himself behind a shell crater 20 yards back. Luis carried a Thompson submachine gun in addition to his medical supplies, because Luis understood that sometimes the best medicine was preventing wounds in the first place. Intelligence said 8 to 12, Marcus replied. But intelligence also said we'd be home by Christmas, so take that for what it's worth. A bitter laugh rippled through their small cluster of men. Christmas was 3 days away. They were nowhere near home. The bunker sat at the intersection of 2 critical roads, supply routes that the Allies desperately needed to maintain their push toward the Rhine. Command had been clear. Take the bunker, secure the roads, move forward. They made it sound simple, like ordering coffee. They didn't mention the lives it would cost. They never did. Jimmy studied the structure through the thinning mist. It was a Regelbau 58C, he thought, one of the standardized bunker designs the Germans loved. Thick walls, narrow firing slits, designed to withstand everything except a direct hit from heavy artillery, which they didn't have. What they had was small arms, a few grenades, and Jimmy's bar. The Browning automatic rifle was a beautiful contradiction. Too heavy to be a true rifle, too light to be a true machine gun. It existed in that deadly middle ground, capable of sustained automatic fire while still being shoulder-fired. In the right hands, it was devastating. Jimmy's hands had become the right hands somewhere along the road from Normandy. He didn't remember exactly when. The transformation had been gradual. Baptism by fire stretched across months and miles. "Sun's coming up," Danny whispered, his voice cracking. "We should move before we lose the cover." He wasn't wrong. The eastern sky was beginning to bleed pink and orange, beautiful colors that belonged in paintings and poems, not battlefields. But war didn't care about aesthetics. War transformed everything it touched, made mockeries of beauty and meaning. Marcus checked his watch, a German timepiece he'd taken from a dead officer outside Bastogne. He'd never said whether he'd killed the officer or simply found him. Nobody asked. Out here, such distinctions felt meaningless. 5 minutes, Marcus decided. We use the fog while we have it. Jimmy, you're primary. Danny, you're secondary with the Springfield. Luis, you cover our retreat if this goes sideways. I'll mark targets and throw smoke. It was a plan. Not a good plan. There were no good plans for assaulting a fortified position with 4 men, but a plan nonetheless. Jimmy shifted his weight, feeling the bar settle against his shoulder. He'd loaded a fresh magazine before dawn. 20 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, each bullet capable of punching through wood, flesh, and hope with equal efficiency. He had 4 more magazines in his belt, plus 2 in his pack. 100 rounds total. It sounded like a lot until you started firing. Remember North Africa? Marcus said suddenly, his voice barely a thread of sound. Remember that German tank outside Kasserine? Jimmy remembered. It had been their first real engagement, before they'd learned to be soldiers instead of just men in uniforms. The tank had seemed invincible, a steel dragon breathing fire. They'd been pinned down for hours until Marcus had organized a flanking maneuver that let them get close enough to disable it with grenades. For men had died buying them that chance. Jimmy could still name each one, could still see their faces when he closed his eyes. This ain't North Africa, Danny muttered. No, Marcus agreed. But the principle's the same. Germans put their faith in steel and concrete. Think it makes them invincible. But every fortress has a weakness. Every wall has a crack. What's the crack here? Luis asked from his crater. Marcus smiled, though there was no humor in it. Overconfidence. They've been sitting in that bunker for 3 weeks without being seriously challenged. They think they're safe. Safe men get sloppy. Jimmy wondered if that was true or if Marcus was just trying to boost their morale. It didn't matter. They were going forward regardless. Orders were orders, and even when orders were suicide dressed up as tactics, you followed them because the alternative was chaos. The wind shifted, carrying new sounds from the bunker. A radio playing music, something classical, Wagner maybe. The Germans loved Wagner. The irony wasn't lost on Jimmy. These men who'd spent years trying to kill him probably loved music, had families, wrote letters home about hoping to see spring again. War didn't erase humanity. It just made humanity irrelevant. You couldn't think about the enemy's mother while you were trying to kill him. Couldn't wonder about his dreams while you were ending them. Movement, Danny hissed. Door. They all froze. The bunker's main entrance, a heavy steel door set into the concrete, was opening. Not fully, just a crack. Someone was checking the perimeter or maybe just getting fresh air. A cigarette tip glowed in the darkness of the doorway. A tiny star in a universe of violence. Marcus held up a closed fist. Wait, not yet. The seconds stretched like taffy, elastic and unbearable. Jimmy's heart hammered against his ribs. a drumbeat that seemed loud enough to give away their position. His finger rested alongside the bar's trigger guard. Never on the trigger until you were ready to fire. Basic training lesson drilled into them until it became instinct. The door closed. The cigarette disappeared. Marcus's fist opened. Move. They advanced in a broken line, using every scrap of cover the forest provided. Jimmy moved in a crouch, the bar's weight distributed across his body through practice and muscle memory. He'd carried this weapon across France, had cleaned it in foxholes and ruined churches, had slept with it like a lover. He knew its quirks, the slight pull to the right after the fifth round, the way the barrel heated up during sustained fire, the particular music it made when cycling through ammunition. 50 yards from the bunker. 40. 30. The fog was dissipating faster now, morning asserting itself despite the winter's best efforts. Soon they'd be exposed. Soon this would transition from stealth to storm, from patience to violence. Contact left. Danny's voice cracked with adrenaline. A German soldier had emerged from a concealed position, a foxhole they'd missed in their reconnaissance. He was young, maybe younger than Danny, with a face that still held traces of boyhood despite the uniform and the Mauser rifle in his hands. Time fragmented. The German's eyes widened, recognition and fear arriving simultaneously. His mouth opened to shout a warning. Jimmy was already moving, already bringing the bar around, already making calculations that lived somewhere below conscious thought. Distance, wind, trajectory, the mathematics of murder. 3-round burst. The bar spoke with its distinctive voice, slower than a machine gun, faster than death should be. The sound echoed through the forest, shattering the morning's fragile peace. The German soldier folded, puppet by physics and finality. He didn't scream. They rarely screamed when it happened fast. But the damage was done. Their cover was blown. The bunker erupted with activity. Shouts in German, sharp and urgent. The machine gun nest Marcus had spotted swiveled toward them, its barrel seeking targets with mechanical precision. Smoke! Marcus barked, already pulling grenades from his belt. White phosphorus blossomed across the bunker's face, artificial fog to replace what the morning had stolen. Jimmy used the cover to advance, Danny and Luis following in a practiced formation they developed through trial and terrible error. The machine gun opened up, MG-42 fire that sounded like tearing canvas, impossibly fast, impossibly loud. Rounds chewed through the forest, turning trees into sawdust and cover into concept. But the smoke confused them, made precision impossible. Jimmy reached a depression in the ground, some old shell crater that had become just another feature of the scarred landscape. He set up the bar on its bipod, taking a firing position that gave him angles on both the machine gun nest and the main entrance. Suppressing fire, Marcus shouted, throwing another smoke grenade. Jimmy squeezed the trigger. The bar came alive in his hands, 20 rounds cycling through in controlled bursts. He walked the fire across the bunker's face, aiming for the firing slits, the ventilation points, anywhere that looked like a weakness. Spent brass arced through the air, catching the morning light, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The machine gun fell silent. Whether he'd hit the crew or just forced them to take cover, Jimmy couldn't tell. Didn't matter. Silent was silent. Moving, Luis called, making a dash toward a better position. Danny provided covering fire with his Springfield, picking shots with the careful precision of a trained marksman. The kid was terrified. Jimmy could see it in every movement, but he was doing his job. Fear didn't make you a coward. Running did. Danny was running forward, not back. Another German soldier appeared at a firing slit, framed by concrete and morning light. Jimmy's burst caught him before he could fire, and the man disappeared back into the bunker's darkness like he'd never existed. How many? Marcus shouted over the chaos. At least 5 confirmed visual. Jimmy replied, changing magazines with practice speed. Fresh magazine in, old magazine pocketed. You never left equipment on the battlefield if you could help it. 20 more rounds ready to transform intent into impact. The bunker's main door flew open. Not cautious this time, not tentative. Desperate. 3 German soldiers poured out, firing as they came, a breakout attempt. They'd realized they were being suppressed and decided to attack instead of defending. Bold. Stupid. The line between the two was often invisible. Jimmy swung the bar toward them, but Danny was faster. His Springfield cracked once, twice, 3 times. 2 of the Germans went down. The third made it 5 steps before Louis's Thompson stitched a line across his chest, and he collapsed into the mud that Belgium seemed to be made of. "Reload," Danny called, his voice high and tight. "Covered." Jimmy responded, keeping pressure on the bunker with short bursts. The reality of combat was nothing like the movies. It was chaos and confusion, punctuated by moments of crystalline clarity that felt more like hallucination than memory. Jimmy's world had narrowed to iron sights and trigger pulls, to fields of fire and lines of advance. Everything else, home, family, the person he'd been before the war, existed in some other dimension, unreachable and increasingly unreal. Marcus was at the bunker's eastern wall now, placing charges against the ventilation shaft with the calm precision of a man disarming a bomb rather than creating an explosion. He'd been a demolitions expert in civilian life, had worked construction in Atlanta before the war. That knowledge had kept them alive more times than Jimmy could count. 30 seconds. Marcus shouted. "Get clear." Jimmy fired one more burst into a firing slit where movement had flickered, then scrambled backward, using the terrain for cover. Danny and Luis were already retreating to safe distance, their faces masks of concentration and barely suppressed terror. Marcus sprinted away from the bunker, unreeling detonation chord as he ran. He dove behind the same fallen log that had sheltered them earlier, his hands working the plunger with the confidence of long practice. Fire in the hole! The explosion wasn't the Hollywood fireball of cinema. It was pressure and percussion, a concussive wave that turned the air solid for a heartbeat. The ventilation shaft collapsed inward, and smoke began pouring from the bunker's firing slits. Not the white smoke of their grenades, but the black, oily smoke of things burning that were never meant to burn. Screams erupted from inside. German voices, high and panicked, shouting for help that wouldn't come. The sound burrowed into Jimmy's chest and made a home there. Another memory he'd carry forever. The main door burst open again. More Germans, these ones not attacking but fleeing, their uniforms smoking, their faces blackened by soot and streaked with terror. They'd abandoned their weapons, weren't fighting anymore, were just men trying not to die. "Hold fire," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jimmy's finger tensed on the trigger but obeyed. The Germans stumbled out into the morning light, coughing, gasping, and several fell to their knees in the mud. One of them was crying. Another was praying in German, the words coming fast and desperate. "Hands up! Hand hoch!" Danny shouted, his Springfield trained on the surrendering soldiers. They complied, raising their hands with the exhausted compliance of men who'd reached the end of resistance. 7 of them total. 7 men who'd been trying to kill them minutes ago, now reduced to prisoners, to problems, to paperwork. Luis moved forward, his medic instincts overriding everything else. 2 of the Germans were badly burned, their hands and faces blistered and weeping. He began treating them with the same care he'd give American soldiers, because Luis had taken an oath that transcended nationality. Jimmy stood slowly, the bar still at the ready, scanning for threats that no longer existed. The bunker was finished, smoke pouring from its mouth like a dying dragon's final breath. The machine gun nest was silent. The road was secure. They'd won. Felt nothing like victory. Marcus was already on the radio, calling in their success to command. His voice was flat, professional, empty of the triumph that civilians probably imagined accompanied such moments. They'd completed their objective. They'd survived. Tomorrow they'd do it again, and the day after that until the war ended or they did. Jimmy walked toward the bunker's entrance, morbid curiosity pulling him forward. Inside, the smoke was beginning to clear, revealing the interior that men had lived in, had defended, had died for. Bunks lined one wall. A small table held playing cards and photographs. Someone's family, frozen in a moment of peace that felt like archaeology from a lost civilization. A photograph of a woman and 2 children, smiling. The image seemed obscene in its normalness, its reminder that the men who'd occupied this bunker had been human, had loved in return. "Don't," Marcus said, appearing at Jimmy's shoulder. "Don't look too close. Don't wonder too much. That way lies madness." But Jimmy had already seen. In the back of the bunker, near where Marcus's charges had detonated, 3 German soldiers lay in positions that suggested they died instantly. They looked peaceful, almost, their faces relaxed in a way that sleeping people never quite achieved. Death had a particular stillness that sleep couldn't replicate. "How many?" Jimmy asked, though he already knew. 3 dead inside, 7 captured. 10 total, which means intelligence was close for once. Marcus paused, looking at the carnage with eyes that had seen too much to register shock anymore. "You did good, Jimmy. That bar work at the firing slits probably saved our lives." Jimmy nodded, accepting the praise without feeling it. He'd done his job. The weapon had functioned as designed. Men had died as a result. The calculus was simple and terrible. Danny approached, his face pale even in the growing morning light. "One of them asked me for water," he said, his voice small. "One of the prisoners. He asked in English. Said he was from Munich. Asked if I'd ever been there." The kid's hands were shaking. "I gave him my canteen." "That was right," Marcus said firmly. "War doesn't mean we stop being human. Just means we have to fight to remember how." They spent the next hour securing the position, treating the wounded, and documenting the scene for the after-action report. The captured Germans sat in a huddle, guarded by Danny while Luis worked on their burns. They didn't look like the enemy anymore. They looked like what they were. Young men far from home, caught in a machine greater than themselves, just trying to survive until they could go back to lives that might not exist anymore. The sun had fully risen by the time reinforcements arrived. A squad from Baker Company, fresh-faced and eager, men who hadn't yet learned that survival was more important than glory. They looked at the bunker, at the prisoners, at Jimmy's squad with something like awe. "You guys took this position with 4 men?" one of them asked, his voice thick with admiration. 6, Marcus corrected, his voice hard. "We had 6 this morning. You're standing where Corporal Morrison and Private Katz were yesterday. They're the ones who did the real work, dying so we could get close enough to matter." The reinforcements fell silent, chastened. War had a way of teaching humility to those who lived long enough to learn. Morrison outlined their next mission: eliminate a German observation post in a church tower without destroying the village or harming civilians. It was the kind of impossible task that had become routine. Marcus accepted the orders with his usual stoicism, and the squad prepared for another night operation. As they gathered supplies, Jimmy reflected on how war had transformed him. The engineering student who'd wanted to build cars now built nothing but corpse counts. Danny wrote another letter home, filling pages with comfortable lies. Luis organized his dwindling medical supplies, knowing they'd never be enough. Marcus studied maps, carrying the weight of keeping them alive through tactical brilliance. That night, before the mission, Jimmy allowed himself to remember Philadelphia completely. His mother's piano lessons drifting through open windows, his father's patient explanations of balance sheets, Margaret's laughter. He remembered being someone who believed problems had solutions, that intelligence and effort could overcome obstacles. War had taught him differently. War had taught him that sometimes survival was luck, death was random, and the only meaning was what you invented to stay sane. They moved out at 0200 hours, 4 men against darkness and German efficiency. The church tower operation became a nightmare. What intelligence promised would be 3, maybe 4 Germans turned into a full platoon using the village as a staging area. Jimmy's squad found themselves trapped, pinned down by superior numbers in the ruins of what had been someone's home. The bar became their salvation. Jimmy discovered firing positions the Germans hadn't anticipated, using the weapon's unique capability to deliver sustained automatic fire from a shoulder-mounted platform. He eliminated the observation post crew with a single devastating burst, the legendary moment that would define his war, but the fight was far from over. Over 3 brutal hours, they fought building to building. Danny took a bullet through his shoulder but kept firing. Luis treated him while simultaneously engaging targets with his Thompson. Marcus orchestrated their fighting retreat with the precision of a conductor, turning chaos into survivable disaster. German soldiers began surrendering, shocked by the firepower 4 Americans could generate. They hadn't believed one bar could cut down an entire squad, until they saw it happen. Jimmy's weapon work became the stuff of immediate legend, stories spreading through both armies about the American corporal who fought like a demon. But victory had costs. They saved the village, eliminated the observation post, and captured 37 enemy soldiers. But Baker Company lost 12 men supporting their action. Jimmy killed more Germans that night than he could count, each death adding weight to his soul. The civilians emerged from basements, old men, women, children with eyes that had seen too much. They thanked the Americans in broken English, offered what little food they had. A young girl gave Jimmy a hand-drawn picture of an angel. He kept it, though he knew he was no angel. Angels didn't do what he'd done. Word of the church tower action reached command. Jimmy was awarded the Silver Star, though he felt nothing receiving it. Marcus was promoted to first sergeant. Danny recovered from his wound. Luis continued saving lives with diminishing supplies and infinite determination. But something had broken in Jimmy that night. He'd become too efficient at killing, too comfortable with violence. He started having nightmares where he couldn't stop firing, where the bar wouldn't release, where every face became the young German from Munich who'd wanted to be a doctor. The squad noticed. Marcus pulled him aside, spoke with the gentle firmness of someone who understood. "You're not losing yourself," Marcus said. "You're grieving who you were. That's different. One can heal, the other can't." Letters from home piled up unread. His mother wrote about Margaret's wedding, about victory gardens, about hope. Jimmy couldn't connect those words to his reality. The distance between Philadelphia and Belgium wasn't measured in miles, but in experiences that couldn't be translated. The war ground forward. They fought through December into January, surviving the Battle of the Bulge through skill and fortune. Each engagement taught them new ways to survive, new ways to kill, new ways to carry what they'd become. January became February. February became March. Germany began collapsing, the Third Reich crumbling under combined pressure from east and west. Jimmy's squad was there for the final pushes, witnessing the end of Hitler's empire in real time. They liberated a concentration camp. The horror they found there redefined their understanding of evil, made their own violence seem almost justified. Almost. Jimmy looked at the skeletal survivors and understood why they fought, even if he couldn't understand what they'd become in the fighting. V-Day arrived. May 8, 1945. Europe was free. The war was over. They'd survived. The squad separated slowly. Luis went home to Texas, determined to become a real doctor. Danny returned to Ohio, married his sweetheart, tried to forget. Marcus stayed in the army, finding purpose in the structure that civilian life couldn't provide. Jimmy went back to Philadelphia, to a hero's welcome he didn't feel he deserved. His family threw a party. Neighbors celebrated. Margaret introduced him to her husband. Everyone wanted to hear war stories, wanted glory narratives that didn't exist. He couldn't explain, couldn't make them understand. The distance he'd felt in Belgium hadn't disappeared. It had grown. He was home but not home, present but absent. Jimmy enrolled at Columbia using the GI Bill, studying engineering like he'd always planned. The math was still clean, still pure, still offered right answers. It helped. Slowly, incrementally, he began remembering how to be human instead of just functional. He met a woman named Helen at a library. She was patient, understanding, didn't push. They married in 1949. He never told her everything, but he told her enough. 10 years later, 1955. Jimmy had 2 children, a house in the suburbs, a job designing automotive components. On the surface, he'd achieved the American dream. The nightmares came less frequently. The bar existed only in memories that grew hazier with time. He received a letter from Luis, now Dr. Luis Chavez, running a clinic in Houston. They corresponded occasionally, careful conversations that acknowledged shared past without drowning in it. 20 years later, 1965. Marcus retired from the Army as a command sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank. He visited Philadelphia and they met for coffee. Two old men drinking terrible coffee, laughing about nothing, carrying everything. Did we do right? Jimmy asked the question he'd never quite answered. We survived, Marcus replied. We helped each other survive. That's all the right there is in war. Everything else is philosopher's territory. 30 years later, 1975. Danny died of a heart attack at 51. The war had taken him after all, just slowly. Jimmy flew to Ohio for the funeral, reconnected with Luis. They didn't talk about Belgium. They didn't need to. Final years, 1985. Jimmy retired at 63, finally allowing himself to rest. He volunteered teaching math to underprivileged kids, finding purpose in building futures instead of taking them. Helen kept him grounded. His children gave him grandchildren who knew only the peaceful grandfather, never the soldier. One day, cleaning the attic, his grandson found an old photograph. For young men in uniform, standing by a captured bunker, trying to smile. Who are they, Grandpa? Jimmy looked at the faces, Marcus, Luis, Danny himself. Young faces that had seen old horrors. Friends, he said simply. The best friends I ever had. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The grandson asked about the war. Jimmy told him stories. Edited versions, cleaned of blood and terror, shaped into lessons about courage and sacrifice. The boy listened with the wide-eyed attention children give to legends. Later, alone, Jimmy held the photograph and let himself remember fully. The weight of the bar. The sound of German voices. The moment that made him a legend. One burst cutting down a bunker squad, impossible physics made real through skill and desperation. He'd been good at killing. War had required it. Peace had let him become good at living instead. Marcus died in 1988. Luis followed in 1990. Jimmy attended both funerals, the last survivor of their squad. He carried their stories with him, guardian of memories that mattered. Final scene, 1995. James Theodore Holloway III died peacefully at 73, surrounded by family. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star, his engineering career, his community work. It didn't mention the nightmares, the weight, the cost of survival. His grandson, now a history teacher, included Jimmy's story in his World War II curriculum. The legend of the bar burst that took down a bunker squad lived on, told to new generations as an example of American courage and capability. But Jimmy would have wanted them to know more, would have wanted them to understand that war created no heroes, only survivors. That violence, even justified violence, left scars. That the real courage was living afterward, carrying the weight without letting it crush you. The bar that Jimmy carried through Europe ended up in a museum, labeled with his name and the church tower action. Students filed past it, seeing metal and wood, history-made artifact. They couldn't see what Jimmy had seen. The faces, the fear, the terrible efficiency of killing. They couldn't feel the weight it carried beyond its 20 pounds. Maybe that was mercy. War's end. Soldiers come home. Life continues. The extraordinary becomes ordinary as years accumulate distance from trauma. Jimmy had proven that survival was possible, that men shaped by violence could reshape themselves through love, purpose, and time. His story wasn't just about one remarkable moment with a weapon. It was about all the moments after, choosing life over memory, building instead of destroying, teaching instead of haunting. For men had stood together in a Belgian forest, certain they'd die before dawn. They'd survive through skill and luck and love for each other. That survival echoed through decades, through families, through lives built on foundations of shared sacrifice. The war had tried to reduce them to functions: Jimmy the bargunner, Marcus the tactician, Luis the healer, Danny the marksman. They'd refused that reduction, reclaimed their humanity piece by piece, day by day, until they were men again instead of just soldiers. That was the real victory. Not the bunker, not the medals. The victory was living, fully and completely, despite everything war had tried to teach them about death.